Good morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is the current relationship between China and Africa. But today's subject is at the backdrop of the current 2024 China-Africa Summit taking place in China. But fellows, before I dive into this subject today, let's go ahead and watch a brief video of China's President Xi Jinping, welcoming some African leaders to this summit. And I'll come back and dissect this whole China-Africa relationship, the pros and cons of all of it, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and watch this brief video of him welcoming some African leaders. Let's go ahead and see what we got here. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead.
The China-Africa Summit commenced on Wednesday, with President Xi Jinping and his wife hosting a banquet to welcome the attending leaders. Over the course of the three-day summit, leaders from around 50 African countries will discuss future cooperation in areas such as agriculture, security, and industrialization. On Wednesday, President Xi held bilateral meetings with leaders from South Africa, Djibouti, Cameroon, and others. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres attended the summit as a special guest. China, having been Africa's largest trading partner and investor for years, has strengthened its ties with African nations to counter US and European influence in the global South. Under the theme, joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future, the summit aims to deepen friendships and outline future cooperation. The FOCAC Summit's opening ceremony is scheduled for Thursday, where President Xi will deliver a keynote speech.
All right, fellows. So now you have it. All the hype about this China-Africa Summit being talked about all across global networks and so on. But now the question is, after these MOUs, bilateral agreements, security agreements, trade agreements, and all that stuff have been talked about and negotiated with Chinese officials in China, then the question becomes, will China then become the solution to Africa's socio-economic development? And will China's model of economic development also be the best model for Africa, as some people in the news media in Africa and other parts of the world have suggested, which I strongly differ on that particular issue in terms of the model. Because if you want to understand where China is today, then you have to go back about 70 years ago. Mao Zedong, the Cultural Revolution. I disagree every aspect of the Cultural Revolution that took place during Mao Zedong's era. But there's only one aspect of that Cultural Revolution that I really agreed with regards to that Mao Zedong's era, which is the self-actualization and the self-pride of the Chinese. The inward thinking that the Chinese was just as better as the Europeans and anybody else. And China can develop and build its own economy and its own country and culturally live as Chinese without importing foreign cultures into China. That is one area that I agree in terms of the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong. Other than that, the rest was all full of baloney, bananas. I mean, that was, one of the coolest things to ever, talk about. But when it came to the self-actualization of the Chinese, the self-pride of the Chinese, then on that part of the Cultural Revolution, I agreed. And I strongly believe also that it was that self-actualization, that self-confidence, that self-pride of the Chinese that in the latter years, after the death of Mao Zedong and the successive governments in the 70s, all the way through to the 80s, especially in the mid-80s, when the Chinese government decided to start taking the initiatives of the economic reforms that will eventually become the reforms that they will implement after the fall of the U.S.Aaaa, with the cooperation of American investment and American companies and enterprises. China will become China today because of the United States of America. China will become China today because of American companies like Walmart, Target, Apple, Nike, and all these Intel and all these big American industries. Because during the 80s, Ronald Reagan era, which was also the Cold War era, when the West, America, taking the lead of promoting the idea of globalization, market economic systems to the world, trying to use that to debunk the notion of communism and socialism in Europe against the USSR, Russia at that time. Because if you look back in the 80s, most of the countries around the world, I would say about 80% of the world countries were all communist or socialists. Majority of them were communists because the USSR has had a lot of clout over almost all of Southeast Asia. So they were all practicing communism. But it was during the mid-80s when the collapse of the USSR started under Boris Yeltsin, under Gorbachev, before Boris Yeltsin. That is when most of these Southeastern Asian countries, China, started taking the initiative to reform its economic system and started adapting capitalism by allowing foreign investments into China. It was around that time that Walmart and these big American corporations, looking for cheap labor, decided to set up factories, shops in China and started investing in China. And it is out of that investments from Walmart, Nike, Apple, Intel, and followed by other European companies. That is what made China what China is today. So when I hear people on the African news networks and other European and Middle East networks talking about is Africa going to adapt the Chinese model of its socioeconomic development, my question to those people is, what model did China have? China's model was quasi-government-owned industries. China did not have money in the 80s or 90s to invest into their economy, to build that economy to become what it became. It was the Americans and the Europeans, companies that invested in China. They were the ones who made China what China is today. Let's not forget that. China didn't have money to pump into its economy. China was a communist country. Out of cheap labor that the Americans and the European companies decided to take advantage of in China, because China had one thing good going for them, which was they had a pretty decent infrastructure system. And so the Western companies like Walmart, Nike, Target, and all these big companies around in the West decided to tap into that, infrastructure and the technical know-how of the Chinese to invest in China. So it was the West that set the ball rolling for China's socioeconomic development. So if you're talking about model of socioeconomic development that Africa have to adapt, there's no better model than adapting the American model of socioeconomic development. There's no better model. Because China will never have become what you see today of China without the United States of America. Period. I don't care what anybody says. Go look at your own facts. I mean, go check with the Chinese themselves. Around the 80s, 90s, look at the GDP of China. What did China have? Nothing. China was a dead poor country, poorer than a lot of African countries. But for China to become China, it is the United States of American companies. Because America's global market system, idea of a global market system was basically to encourage the world, the globe, to adapt capitalism. So that when they adapt capitalism, American products and Western products will infiltrate in these new countries, emerging markets. That will also help boost American and Western countries' economy. That was the basic idea of the global market system that was touted by Ronald Reagan and the West in the 80s to counter communism. That was the whole idea. Because the market will open up and American companies and Western companies will have the opportunity to sell their products to make more money in these emerging markets. That was the whole idea of the global market system that was introduced by Reagan administration and the Western countries in the 80s. So if China will benefit from this global market system, they will benefit because American companies, looking at China's cheap labor, decided to use that cheap labor to build factories and manufacture products in China and then ship them back to the United States and to Western countries and sell them for higher profits. That is all it was. That's all it was. And then you ended up having Japan and other Western European countries also following the same pattern. So you have all these Western countries and America and Japan, now all of them setting up factories and shops in China because of the cheap labor. So it is that money, investments, that came from the United States of America, as well as from Europe and Japan, that made China what China is. So the Chinese technical know-how that you see today all came from the West. Most of them came from the West. That is the bottom line. There's no ifs and buts about it. So when I hear people talking about if Africa is going to adopt the Chinese model of a socioeconomic development, my question is, what Chinese model? China right now, what you see about China right now economically is basically they have adopted the capitalist system, which I'll call somehow quasi-capitalist system, where you still have government controls. And then in terms of their political system, it's still a communist one-party system. So basically, its economic system is more like a quasi-capitalist system with the heavy hand of the government involved in its market system. But if you look at the underlying factor of where China is today, there's no ifs and buts about it, that China will never be what it is today without the United States of America's companies and Western, European, and Japan. Period. There's no ifs and buts about it. I mean, this is just about 40 years ago. I mean, just go back and Google yourself. 40 years ago, look at China. On the highways of China, what would you see down there? All you see were bicycles. All you see were bicycles. Until after the fall of the U.S.Aaaa. It was the fall of the U.S.Aaaa that pretty much kickstarted the development of China. Because at that point, the Chinese didn't have anybody to follow because most China was communist. India was pretty much communist. Most of Southeast Asian countries were all communist. And all of them were in line with the U.S.Aaaa. So with the fall of the U.S.Aaaa, a lot of these Southeastern communist countries didn't have anywhere to fall on. America became the only superpower and is still the only superpower, both economically and militarily. So at the end of the day, they all started adapting and started with these reforms, economic reforms, into capitalism gradually. And that is what the Chinese did. And that was a smart move by the Chinese. They started setting up their initiatives and they started encouraging big American companies like Walmart for them to come and invest in China. And that is what American companies did because of this cheap labor. But if these American companies had not gone to China, I'm sorry, China will not be what it is today. It was the American companies that took the initiative when the Chinese started with the economic reforms, that decided that because of the cheap labor and because China had the technical know-how in some key areas of manufacturing, it was good for them to invest in China than other Southeastern Asian countries. And also looking at the market size of China's population, all were contributing factors of the Western countries' businesses. In order to make more money, they decided to go and set shops and factories in China to help build their products in China, and then in the end, send it back to the United States and send it to Europe and sell it for higher profits. And that is how China was able to become developed. And that is the model. The model was American companies going to set up factories down there. So if you Africans talking about the model of socioeconomic development, there's no better model than American companies. You have to take care of your infrastructure first. Take care of your infrastructure and create a good avenue of economic development for foreign companies to come in and also invest on that continent. So there's no better model of socioeconomic development for Africa than the United States and Western model. Hero. I mean, China now is what it is. Yes, I don't have a problem when China comes to Africa with all that investment, with the, what do you call it, the Belt and Road Initiative and all that. That's all great and well and good. But at the end of the day, Africa have to look all over the world and have a better deal with whether America, Europe, Japan, China, South Korea, it doesn't matter what it is. But you have to set the foundation of having a good infrastructure network. That's the bottom line. You have to start with that, and security. You have to create a good environment for businesses to come in there and invest. Because if you look at Africa labor, Africa has the cheapest labor in the world. So if you have the foundation of good infrastructure and good security for these foreign companies to come and invest on the continent, there's no better place for these foreign companies to come and invest than Africa. I mean, look at the labor cost. But also, if you look at where Africa is in terms of infrastructure, we have very poor infrastructure. And in some cases, we have the bad security systems. So at the end of the day, these are the deterrents of foreign investment into our continent. But if we're able to set all these things in motion with good infrastructures, good security network, to assure these foreign investors that they will be fine on the continent, there's no better place for these foreign investors to come and invest than Africa. There's no better place. Well, why would American companies go and set up shops now in China and be spending what, $5 to $10 an hour when they can pay like $1 or $2 in Africa? I mean, there's no better place. So when I hear people talking about the model of Africans adopting the China model, what China model? I mean, the China model was an American model. It was Americans who invested in China to make China what China is. It was the West that made China what it is because of cheap labor. And that is what it is. There was no model that the Chinese adopted. The only model that the Chinese adopted was the quasi-government controls, where government owns a lot of their industries with a private sector. That is all it is. But outside of that, it was the Western countries, the United States of America, taking the lead because of cheap labor to create the avenue for other Western countries and Japan to follow and invest in China. That is what made China what China is. So if people want to talk about the model for Africa to follow, there's no better model than the Western model of the United States of America. Hero, there's no better model than American model. I'm sorry. I mean, this is the wealthiest country on the planet Earth, fellows. That's what we are talking about. There's no country right now that has a better economic system than the United States of America. America have been the better economic system for the past over 100 years. Over more than 100 years, there's no country on this planet Earth that have had a better economic system than the United States of America. I know some people will say, oh, capitalism is full of greed and all that stuff. You know, I get all of that. But at the end of the day, look at the economies around the world. Look at the COVID era. How much money America was supposed to give to its citizens? Thousands of dollars. How many countries on this planet Earth was able to do that? I mean, go figure. You know, so at the end of the day, you're looking at the economic system that Africa can model its economic development on. But it has to start with infrastructure and security and to end the level of corruption. Because bear in mind, American companies cannot invest in any African country or in any country outside of the United States and pay bribes and get contracts and so on and so forth. It's against the law in the United States. So for you to be able to attract foreign investment from the United States of America, then you have to have your homework done really well. You have to make sure you set up the foundation for infrastructure, security, and make sure you don't have corrupt systems in your countries. Because American companies are not going to come and invest in your countries if you expect them to come and pay bribes, because it's against the law in the United States of America. American companies cannot pay bribe or fine, do anything, any shenanigans to get contracts. They won't do it, because in their law here, they will be against the law in the United States. So fellas, when I hear people talk about this model, and about China and all that, look, China is great for Africa. There's nothing wrong with that. China has done some great things for Africa in terms of and infrastructure development and so on and so forth. And I don't blame China for some of the shortfalls that have also taken place on the continent. The unfortunate truth is that the Chinese have to have strings attached to the loans they give African countries, but they don't. They tend to turn a blind eye because of their need for resources from Africa. But it's up to the African government to also negotiate better deals with the Chinese. Because you hear a lot of this talk about people talking about how China is indebting Africa and how China is taking over African ports and airports and electrical grid and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I don't blame the Chinese for that. And the reason I don't blame the Chinese for that is because you have corrupt governments in Africa. Because of most of these African governments are so corrupt that when they're signing these deals with the Chinese, they don't look at the interest of their own African countries. They're looking at the interest of the money, the corrupt money that they can get out of the deals. And the deals that they can help their family businesses and their crony capitalists and get in these deals that they make. So out of that, they don't look at the interest of their fellow African countries. That is the saddest truth, fellows. And out of that, when they default, that's when the Chinese also come in and take over these ports and airports and electrical grids and so on and so forth. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese are not coming there to give you money for free. They are not coming to Africa because they love Africans. No. They are coming to Africa to invest because of China's interests. China's test for energy, minerals, natural resources, and so on and so forth. And I just came across the statistics of Nigeria's trade with China last year. Nigeria spent about $25 billion importing from China. About $25 billion importing from China. How much Nigerian products were exported to China? So that is part of the deal. So when you see these bilateral agreements that is being signed, and you're talking about this China-Africa summit and so on and so forth, if you look at it, all China needs from Africa is pretty much raw materials. China is an export-driven economy. That's what China's economy is. China's economy is an export-driven. So Chinese are very tight of allowing foreign goods to enter China. That is the saddest truth, fellows. And that is where the Africans have to start demanding from Chinese. That if we're going to bring you all these raw materials, which I don't agree with, I think Africans have to also start setting up factories to process these raw materials into manufactured goods so that they can make more money from those goods that they export to other parts of the world. But if the Chinese are taking our raw materials and their test for our raw materials is so high to the extent that they need them, then we also have to ask them to allow us also to export some of our products to China. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the trade deficit between China and Africa, the gap is too big. It's too huge. It doesn't even make sense. So if you look at China and Africa trading, it's more like a one-sided deal. China is the one that benefits at the end of the day from most of the bilateral trade and trade deals between Africa and China. Period. China benefits from all these trade because one, they are getting all raw materials from Africa. Two, Africans are not exporting because China is an export-driven economy. So what Africans are doing is basically importing from China. So the Chinese have to open their market to allow African products also to enter Chinese market. But will China allow that? I don't know. And these are some of the agreements that the African governments have to start negotiating with the Chinese. But if we are always going to supply China with raw materials, keep supplying them raw materials, and then using the money that we get through these Chinese loans to build infrastructures and not use them to help develop our industries so we can start processing some of our raw materials into processed goods or manufactured goods and export them, then we're not going to go nowhere. But at the end of the day, there is no better model for Africa to adapt than the United States and the Western capitalist model. That is the only model that Africa can use to become free of independent from Western imports and other developed countries. But if we are going to keep talking about how much China is bringing money and how China trade with Africa is helping Africa and all that stuff, it's all well and good. But there are some key things that we have to adapt from the Chinese. Because China has a China first policy as well. That's what we have to understand. And that is how they started building the economy. The economy was built on China first policy. Not until recently that they started opening up their economies. They weren't even opening their economies. Like I said, they have export-driven economy. That is what China's economy is based on. It's an export-driven economy. That is, and where did they export to? America and the Western countries. That's what made China what China is. And now China is looking at America and the Western countries who are tightening up on China. And now they're looking at the markets in Africa. And they see the market in Africa as their best option if they cannot sell as much that they used to sell to Western countries and America. So that is why China is so keen on Africa. It's a strategic economic maneuver by China. And I don't fault the Chinese for that, because at the end of the day, you're looking at all your interests. What is good for you? That is what you have to do. You have to look at everything that is good for your citizens. You are not looking at Africa's interest. You're looking at China's interest. So if China's interest is to expand its reach in terms of global export of its products, then they have to look everywhere. And if Africa is one of the key areas, because you're talking about 1.4 billion people, 1.4 billion people that they can, export goods and services to. So at the end of the day, that's a big market for China. But outside of Africa, they're now having a hard time in Europe as well in the United States of America. Ever since the COVID 2020, if you look at the economy of China, it's been going down. Because America and the Western countries have now started tightening their importation of some of these electronic gadgets and other things that they believe that the Chinese are not doing their part on in terms of those deals. So now they started tightening these things. And that is why you see the Chinese economy for the past 4 years now, it's been going down gradually and going down gradually. At the end of the day, there's no model better than the American model. The Chinese model is government-owned, quasi-government, private industries with a heavy hand by the government. That is the Chinese model. China, with all its capitalist maneuvers and so on and so forth, is still deep down a communist country. That's what it is. So at the end of the day, if Africans want to take an economic playbook and adapt a model that will lift Africa out of poverty into the real realm of socio-economic development, there is no better model for Africa to adapt than the United States of America's economic model. Period. There's no better model than the United States of America's model and the Western European countries, as well as Japan's model or South Korea's model. Because if you look at all these countries in Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, What model did they adopt? The United States of America, and then you tweak it according to your own socio-economic systems within your country. That's what you do. You tweak a little bit. You take this here, you take that here, and then you form it to fit your culture. Because at the end of the day, what is economics? Economics is a social science. So you adapt it to the society that you live in. That's the bottom line. So you take the one from here, take some from here, and then you blend it to fit your society. But at the bottom of it, there's no better economic system than the capitalist system of the United States of America. So, all right, fellows, this is all I have for today. If it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a great week. Thank you and peace and love.